Welcome, everybody, to the podcast, Your Places or Mine, otherwise Wipe on Pod, with me, Clive Assett. I am a visiting professor at the University of Cambridge.
And me, John Goodall, the architecture editor of Country Life.
And this is a podcast which is about places and history and the stories and anything else we can think of, isn't it really, John?
Indeed, it's trying to sort of bottle up our conversations that we have after we've seen some particularly fun or intriguing place or building and presenting it to the podcast, which we hope will be of interest to more people than just ourselves.
We enjoy it anyway.
Yes, indeed, we certainly do.
And today we're going to talk about something that one of us knows an enormous amount about. It's about a village in Oxfordshire called Ewelme, which is really a kind of English idyll, but beyond that, it's got a very, very deep and extraordinary and fascinating history. And John, who knows about everything from the Middle Ages, knows more than any living being on the planet about this, because he's written a dissertation about it. And furthermore, he's just been there. There's been a festival, hasn't there?
There has been a festival. Indeed, for people who've never heard of it, I think it's very important just to plead for a little bit of patience, because it is a really extraordinary place, connected with lots of people that you will be aware of historically, but which is indeed, in this very English way, it's tucked away and you might know nothing about it at all, and yet it contains these extraordinary buildings and a wonderful monument from the late Middle Ages. And I was there because last weekend a local who lived in the village organised a festival to celebrate the 550th anniversary of the death of one of the towering figures of this particular village, a woman called Alice, variously Chaucer, or de la Pole, who was the Duchess of Suffolk when she died. And when she died, in fact, she died as her grandfather was Geoffrey Chaucer, the English poet, the first great poet who wrote in English. And if you remember your distant studying of the English language in school, so
could we say this is an example of social mobility, John?
I was about to say she is a really remarkable object of social mobility, because she's buried underneath one of the most important monuments of the Middle Ages in a European sense to survive, and she's called on it a princess.
Good heavens.
And her son at that time is heir effectively to, or becomes at one point in his life, heir to the English throne. So she goes from being the granddaughter of the first English poet, and her grandson her son is married to Edward IV's sister, and her grandchildren are basically killed off by the Tudors because they have a better claim to the throne.
God, isn't it absolutely astounding? Of course, the monument in the church is itself pretty extraordinary, isn't it? Because she's shown both in these robes, sort of on top of the monument, and underneath she's shown as a horrible skeleton.
Yes, it's very
grisly.
It is quite grisly. I mean, so it's the party piece of the place, is that you go through, I mean, we'll describe the whole thing, but indeed her tomb is cut of alabaster, and on top she's shown as a princess wearing a crown, and underneath her emaciated corpse is shown. And as an added and fascinating detail, this emaciated corpse is in fact staring at paintings above the tomb, underneath the tomb chest. And it's actually you can only see those paintings if you lie on your back and sort of squint into the tomb.
And be a corpse.
And be a corpse yourself. Because, curiously, this is that extraordinary thing the Middle Ages did. I mean, it's a work of art, the sculpture of her cadaver, her corpse, looking at paintings. And it's a work of art in communication with another work of art, in an act of eternal devotion.
Amazing.
And these things sort of therefore really represent each other, if you know what I mean. So it is a really extraordinary thing. And
this is, I believe it's the only one of a woman
it's the only
shown as a cadaver.
In England, it is the only one of a woman, but it's also unique because it's quite clear that, unlike every other cadaver that was created that survives in England, it's not meant to be a display object. These tombs with emaciated corpses were often intended to be, they were often used as a sort of warning to the living. They were demonstrative. And indeed, if you go to Canterbury Cathedral, virtually a slightly earlier tomb to an Archbishop of Canterbury called Archbishop Chichele. And it has 3 inscriptions. It has the Archbishop on top in his robes and underneath his cadaver. And there are 3 inscriptions, one addressing the general public as they walk by, saying, I'm an archbishop, look at me now, I'm just a rotting corpse. One addressed to the monks of Canterbury in the choir, saying, I was an archbishop, and, look at me now. And then the third one, facing the throne of the present archbishop, as it was the medieval archbishop's throne was, his stall was opposite this, saying, I was as you are, now look at me.
So we all meet at the same page. We've all got to have the next life.
But Alice
the forefront of our mind.
Indeed, but Alice's one is a much more private monument in a way. But it's very intimate. It shows her with shriveled breasts, and she's holding a shroud across her groin. It's the only concession to sort of decency. And her mouth is slightly open with a bit of red paint in, and slightly open a jar with. I mean, it is, and her hair is sort of bound back. So
John, enough.
Enough.
Too much detail. Because what you must do is to explain. I mean, this is such a beautiful village, isn't it?
It is.
Just to visit this village, whether you know anything about the history or not, it's extraordinary.
It's on the edge of the Chilterns, and it takes its name, Anglo-Saxon, I think, meaning a fresh spring, Ewelme, this very strange name that nobody ever seems to...
Well, one of the things that I particularly remember is that it has watercress beds
exactly
at the bottom, which only grow in very fresh water.
That's right, running down the village
street, and it's sold. You can go along and put.
Really? Could you bought watercress? I've never been able to buy watercress.
I seem to remember there being a sort of fridge or cold store or something, and you put in £1. I mean, it's one of those sort of honesty systems.
That must have been a long time ago, though. I think.
I didn't say it wasn't.
But indeed, it's a sort of it's a dell, and it's a really beautiful. The village street, as you say, runs along beside this, and
then you go up, don't you? It's on a sort of bit of a bluff. Is that right?
Well, just at the end of the village street, there's a hill indeed rising up, and you have in sequence these surviving medieval buildings founded in 1437, a school which is still used as a primary school, and a cloister, an almshouse cloister, and then above that the parish church. And so, it really is a little bit like a tiny Oxbridge College somehow being teleported out into the middle of the countryside. And then, within the parish church, we have the tomb we've talked about. And they're all still operating underneath their original endowment. So it's a sort of astonishing survival. And when you're approaching the village from the other side, they rise up the hill, the sequence of buildings really beautifully. It's a magnificent sight.
To make a possibly obvious point, they're all really old. But when I was there on one occasion, because I have been a couple of times, it was very foggy. And so that, these very ancient buildings peering through the fog was very, very striking. But equally striking was the fact that there was also this loud kind of boom, a thud, thud, thud. And it was so cold, it was the rotor blades from the helicopters at Bryce Norton, I think, which is next door. Is it Bryce Norton?
Not Bryce, Benson.
Oh, RAF Benson. And so they had to keep the rotor blades of the helicopters moving so they didn't ice up. And they made this enormous noise, which was, you didn't know where it was coming from, or indeed what it was.
Booming through
this fog. It was an extraordinary experience, I'll never forget. However, that's not typical of this.
No, well, I'm about to. I've never heard, and I've just been down there, on the most beautiful summer's day, and after all this dry weather, the roses, actually everywhere, the roses.
Everything out together.
Are an extraordinary situation, state, and beautiful sunny weather. And a little enthusiasm of mine, which is very eccentric, is just behind. So this person had organised a conference, and it was in the middle of a field. It's sort of the village fields, and they erected a marquee, and about, 250, maybe more people turned up to this thing in the middle of, in the village to hear about.
Gosh.
It was a really astonishing achievement. It was a very, very good audience, and there were some really interesting talks about different things. And to my great excitement, just behind the marquee, there was a stand of mature elm trees, which is something you never, ever see in England. It's in the south of England, really, really extraordinary. Anyway, that was... Well, I did wonder. But anyway, that's by the by.
By the by, but fascinating still. But, John, you better tell us about William de la Pole.
William de la Pole. So, Alice Chaucer...
Well, wait, can I just... Sorry to interrupt, but... Was there anything there before William de la Pole? This this magnificent man.
Yes, I was about to. Yes, exactly. There is, and you need to understand that Alice. She's born Alice Chaucer. Her father is a man called the son of Geoffrey Chaucer, is a man called Thomas Chaucer. He's a diplomat, a royal servant, and they seem to have. He and his wife Maud seem to have no other children apart from Alice. So she's an heiress. Thomas Chaucer marries well, he has quite a lot of property, and Alice is, quite a significant cash. She marries 3 times. The first time as a child bride to a man called Philip, who dies of dysentery, I seem to remember, on the Agincourt campaign in 1415. She then marries this enormous step up socially. She marries the Earl of Salisbury, who's a soldier. And this movement from being, as it were, a commoner to being a member of the nobility is a movement which the importance of which is quite hard to articulate today.
Yes,
I mean, the House of Lords today is much bigger than the nobility of medieval England. And it's a really significant step. But the Earl of Salisbury is, in fact, quite an impoverished nobleman by the standards of things, but he's a soldier.
Yes.
And he then suffers this very painful death. He's the first aristocratic English victim of gunpowder, the siege of Orleans, a bit of a grill, I seem to remember, is ricochet of cannonball, and he dies after 3 days, probably in agony.
Oh dear.
Rather unpleasant, but it leaves Alice ennobled and very rich.
She wasn't that rich.
She was quite rich already, but she's basically building up a bigger and bigger estate. And it's worth saying that one anecdote we have is that in a wedding feast in Paris, allegedly the Duke of Burgundy thinks she's rather beautiful and makes a pass at her, tries to seduce her when she's married to the Earl of Salisbury. And this may be a hint that she's actually a very beautiful woman. It's hard to rescue these things across such distances of time. But she's left a widow a 3rd time, and she marries for the 3rd time to William de la Pole. Now, William de la Pole is from a completely different world in a way. He is the son of his great-grandfather, I think I'm right in saying, is a Hull merchant who becomes very, very wealthy. He's ennobled by Richard II, very controversially, he's sort of as the Earl of Suffolk. And they have a base in Hull, but they marry into this family with property at Wingfield in Suffolk, where they have a castle. And William de la Pole also is involved as a soldier, but he really is the person who inveigles himself into the affections of Henry VI, who comes to the throne as a baby. And as he grows up, William de la Pole is very close to Henry VI. The boy king comes to trust him more and more. And
he really runs England.
And indeed, he establishes...
For better or worse.
Well, I was actually about to say for better or worse. And he establishes around him this group of very aggressive, self-serving figures who become a kind of, a cabal running the kingdom with this boy king. And the marriage, therefore, between Alice and William unites 2 bodies of land. One group of land in connected with Hull, where the wool staple is. Lots and lots of money for William de la Pole from the wool staple in Hull, the wool being the main English product of the time, with land in Suffolk and Wingfield, and it unites it with all these Chaucer properties and Chaucer family properties in the Thames Valley. So it's in fact a massive land holding, and it's all backed up by the fact that William de la Pole is very closely in with the king, and it's quite clear, I think, really, you can infer the fact that Alice becomes both very close to the king, but also to Margaret of Anjou, his wife, Henry VI's wife.
I think, wasn't it the case that William de la Pole fixed up that marriage of the king and Margaret of Anjou?
He's intimately involved. So Margaret of Anjou is obviously a French princess, and he is very, very closely involved in all these things that go on. But I suppose what's really interesting to bear in mind is that the God's House at Ewelme, this almshouse and hospital that's founded attached to the church at Ewelme, it's founded in 1437. I think the 3rd of July, 1437 is when the foundation charter is issued. And this is almost exactly the time that Henry VI is beginning to act as an adult for the first time.
Yes.
So it's almost a grant from the king to show his favour of William de la Pole and Alice.
So it's part of his existing estates. And did he have manor house there or something.
So
Why did he choose it? Because it's virtually what he built was really a palace, wasn't it?
Well, I was about to say, so you need
Was
to...
it referred to as a palace?
Well, latterly it is, because there is Thomas Chaucer, Alice's father, has a house at Ewelme, and he, but in the 1440s, the real interest of Ewelme for the De la Poles is that it's very close to Windsor. And I think that connection with the court is so important to understand.
Yes.
And probably in about 1440s, William de la Pole, who's been Earl of Suffolk, is promoted to being a Marquess of Suffolk. So it's a step up in the hierarchy of titles. And then in 1448, he becomes Duke of Suffolk. But when he becomes a Marquess, he seems, and probably involving Alice, they rebuild Ewelme Manor. And they rebuild it clearly on an absolutely sensational scale and of an with extraordinary opulence. We have the buildings are tragically completely cleared away in the early 17th century by James I for the value of their materials. He has far too many palaces and he needs money more than he needs a house. And only a tiny fragment of these buildings survive. But we do have a herald's account, a description by a herald, I think in 1571, which talks about the interiors as so rich as I did never see the like. And one really peculiar detail, which we know is true because the demolition accounts list them, is that the great hall of this building had decorative beams of iron crossing the interior. And I mean, structural iron is common enough in medieval buildings, but having them used in such a way that an ordinary visitor notices them implies some kind of decorative design. And there is still ironwork.
It would have been a very complicated structure. It's something you could do in iron, but you couldn't do in wood. Would that be right?
Well, it might be the case. I mean, what this herald, Lee, also describes, the things he really fixates on, and he actually sketches them, are the painted ceilings in the rooms, which are in gold and blue. They're a wool pack, because William de la Pole makes his money in wool, skeins of thread, again, probably of wool, and what's called an ape clog. And an ape clog is a collar that you put round a pet ape as a sort of emblem on the ceiling. And in the mid-15th century, it's very common to have these sort of, identifying marks that you put on things.
It was his emblem, wasn't it? It was an ape with a clog, sort of hobbled.
Exactly. I mean, it is an odd thing, and somebody
wasn't he known as jackanapes?
Yes, but I mean that could only be as a result of what he chose.
No, quite. Yes,
I didn't know. Yeah. I mean, it's also important to say about the palace again.
But isn't it odd? One doesn't get what the symbolism, why that would have been attractive to him. But anyway,
no. Well, it's worth saying two more things about the palace. One of which is that we have inventories of the palace from the 1460s, which describe the hanging of the rooms within the palace with tapestry. This fabulously expensive fabric. You can only get hold of tapestry with very kind of close connections to the king through the king's license in this period. And I might talk about that a little bit later because the subjects of the tapestries are really fascinating. But it's actually, the palace is so important that Henry VIII buys it off the subsequent Duke of Suffolk. And he doesn't just buy it, he also turns it into what's called an honour. Now, an honour is basically a group of estates, a huge group of estates, which are attached to a particular property. And this is a dignity of, a really, really unusual dignity to bestow on something. So it's a major property and subsequently a royal palace.
I don't think he really went in for buying things.
No, well, I mean,
he had other means. Acquiring.
When I say he bought,
executing the owner.
No, well, you're right. I think I'm certainly misremembering it in the sense that we only know that he takes the palace over because the Duke of Suffolk writes this letter saying, "I've spent lots and lots of money on this building. Can't you give me something back for it?" And I think the king then says, "Well, I don't think you've spent anything on it at all." So probably there wasn't really a purchase. But I mean, to have it...
Anyway, he got it.
He got it. And to have it as a building of that desirability and to dignify it in this way, again, it's Henry VIII, and we can all understand that, from what survives of his possessions, this is not some small-scale little building. This is a really major building of the 1440s, which has completely disappeared. And, I mean, the history of it is basically, I think Elizabeth I stays there once, and then James I, I say, needs money more than he needs houses, and it's quite derelict by this stage, and the whole thing is cleared away, apart from this little fragment of one range, which the surveyors think is not worth the materials of demolition. So that now survives as a house, but everything else has gone. So it's one of these rather tantalising buildings, something of enormous importance. And I don't know if people know such buildings, but it's of the same generation as Hurstmonceux Castle in West Sussex, a sort of fabulous brick castle built by another of William de la Pole's cronies in the 1440s. Yes. So
the almshouse is built out of brick, isn't it? Not the church, but which has got a sort of checkerwork of stone and flint.
On the east end, that's right.
But the almshouse is brick, which was a very fashionable material under Henry VI, wasn't it?
Yes, because the other thing...
Relatively novel.
It is relatively novel in the English context. And the other thing you need to understand about the buildings there is that Henry VI is obsessed, very curiously, he's really interested in educational projects. And he founds Eton College, which we now know of as a public school, but he founds it as a college in view of Windsor Castle, his seat.
On a Herculean scale.
On a Herculean scale. And he links it to King's College, Cambridge. So he's got a school foundation. And the idea is that people go to school at Eton and then they go on to university, to be educated at university at King's. And this is imitating something that had been done in the late 14th century by William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester, who founds Winchester College in Winchester and attaches it to New College, Oxford, and exactly the same, a school which feeds a university college. But because Henry VI wants Eton to be a royal foundation in every sense, he doesn't just build a small college. He wants this college to be bigger than any other college in the kingdom. Yes, and he actually has at least 3 different designs for Eton, and each stage Eton just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And he was
a bit weak in the head, wasn't he?
Well, that's what I mean. Of course, it's a disaster because the project gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then he goes mad for a period, and Britain slides and England slides into Wars of the Roses, and Eton therefore is never completed. And of the 3 plans he has for it, what survives at Eton today are the college quadrangle, those are domestic buildings of the first Eton, attached to just the the choir of the third Eton.
Good grief.
So it's a sort of a slightly mongrel building overall. But it used to be thought that the only possible explanation for someone sort of knocking everything down every time they got anywhere with it and starting again was that there was some kind of structural problem. But I think it's quite clear that Henry VI just kept on thinking, no, I just want it bigger, even bigger. And so he was actually destroying really substantive works and just sweeping them away and starting again. And William de la Pole is a crucial figure in the foundation of Eton. Now, there is, again, tied in with this, I think you can tell from the dates involved, and it's too complicated to explain in detail, but you must imagine Henry VI is obsessed by these joint foundations, and a lot of the work of designing these joint foundations is taking place at Windsor Castle. So yes. Masons are coming to him and showing him plans and designs and so on and so forth, and he's saying, yes, do it this way, do it that way. William de la Pole is clearly one of the people who's in those discussions, and we know that partly because he signs some of the documents associated with these discussions. But also, I think we can infer that Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's queen, is also involved in those discussions. And it's quite possible, indeed, that Alice de la Pole was herself involved in some of these things. But what you actually have is the sequence of buildings where the Eton College itself is constructed of, the first Eton College is constructed of brick. And there are special brick kilns set up to make the bricks. And this is, as we've said, it's a relatively new material.
Doesn't he send messengers out all over the country to get samples of the best brick-making clay?
Oh, that's okay. No, it's not too much. He does send masons out around the country to measure other buildings to make sure that his building is bigger. So we know that he sends them to New College, Oxford, to Winchester College, and to Salisbury Cathedral. The final chapel of Eton is going to be bigger than Salisbury Cathedral in length. I mean, it's going to be an absolutely extraordinary thing. And anyway, he creates brickworks for this, and William de la Pole is actually involved in things such as approving the design of the hall, of looking at the firing of the bricks and things of this kind. But
brick would be, of course, it's a very expensive material at this time, isn't it?
Well, brick has existed for a long time in English architecture, but until this time it's tended to be made in quite a small scale way, which means that if you have a brick building, you can, in some way, like Hull has a lot of early important brick buildings, but you'd have lots of clamps.
Maybe with a Netherlandish connection, which is a big...
Indeed, indeed. But I suppose the point is that what you're doing is what characteristically is done is there are lots of small makers, and they make individual clamps or ovens of brick, and those bricks can be a very varied size. What's going on in the early 15th century is that the expertise is developing, imported, as you say, from the Baltic and things, to make not just hundreds of bricks, but millions of bricks to a consistent size, which means that you can lay absolutely regular beds of masonry in brick. Yes. And in England too, and at Eton in particular, there is this interest in combining stone facings, detailing windows, doors in carved stone with brick as a contrast in colour, and then laying into the brick what are called diaper patterns. These are patterns of burnt, blackened bricks, and it's like knitting in brick, that you can drop in patterns of crosses and hatching to ornament the brick. So you get this three-tone architecture of stone, red brick and blackened brick.
Were they doing the fancy chimneys by then?
And Eton is a very early example of fancy chimneys in brick, which
very much appealed to the Tudors, isn't it? Because you could do such fantastic things with brick, more so than...
And the origins of this architecture, Tudor brick architecture, are really to be found in the work of Henry V in the early 15th century and of Henry VI. So, and what's also very interesting is that if you imagine that Eton is the sort of first and most important of these buildings, founded in 1440, and then linked to just slightly later foundation, King's College, Cambridge, Margaret of Anjou also then founds her own college in Cambridge, Queen's, which is a brick college, and it's quite clearly related architecturally to Eton. And why Queen's is important is Queen's is generally been accepted as the sort of paradigm Cambridge College plan, with a gatehouse, and you walk in a chapel and a hall range, compactly planned. And this becomes the sort of standard Cambridge model. And in fact, it's quite clear with the dates involved that it must all have been planned at exactly the time that Henry VI is signing off one of his sets of Eton plans. So you've got this very, very close connection. As it were, the king is interested in education, so everybody's interested in education, and including his queen. And this and his foundation at King's in Cambridge is the moment where Cambridge goes from being by far the poor relation of Oxford to being an attractive major university town that rivals Oxford. So, again, and Ewelme uses brick, and it's quite clear that the Ewelme Palace we know is built of brick, and it's clearly using brick being produced from people who are involved in brickworks, presumably at Eton. And we also know, as an added little twist, is that Ewelme today, as I've said, is a school, an almshouse, and a church with the tomb in. It's quite clear that the school is actually a slightly later addition to the foundation of the it's not operating before the 1450s. It's built entirely of brick, unlike the other buildings. And I think it's quite clear, therefore, that it's constructed when work to the palace is underway, Ewelme Palace is underway in brick, and it's a late addition reflecting the king's interest in education.
Gosh.
Do you see what I mean?
It's remarkable. And... well, I'm not sure we shouldn't pause there, John.
Sorry, it's breathless.
We need to give everyone a chance too.
Catch up and refer
But we have great things to come in the second half, because we have the death of the Duke of Suffolk.
Indeed, which is very dramatic
and grisly. But we must also talk about Ewelme as being emblematic of a manor.
Yes, indeed.
Manor, isn't it? So there's much to come in the second half.
There's much to come. Very good.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm hoping I can persuade John to talk a bit about these extraordinary personalities behind
Try and stop me.
So, which shall we begin with Alice or with William?
Well, I think we should start probably with William, because we need to finish his career, don't we, and his rather gruesome end. And I think it's important to say that, during his lifetime, in effect, Alice is a slightly, screened in the documentary evidence, because husbands are more prominent than their wives. I mean, I think Alice it's important to say she's clearly a very, very forceful character, but that the quality of her character really emerges clearly after her husband is rather brutally executed.
Yes.
So you need to understand that William is pretty much running everything. He's got this cabal around the king. He's deeply resented amongst certain parts of the population and amongst many of the nobility. And
But it was all going horribly wrong, isn't it?
well, and there's a sort of backdrop to this in the sense that Henry VI is crowned King of France, of course, in Paris. You need to remember that the political world in which this is taking place is an international one. But in the 1430s, the English have been going abroad, English nobility going abroad and getting property and estates in France. But in the 1430s, of course, everything begins to go, towards the end of the 1430s, things begin to go wrong and everybody begins to come back to England. Yes. And so the competition for patronage, royal patronage, intensifies massively. And people build in competition with one another, and they also brutally fight one another, in the court and elsewhere for this patronage. But
I suppose we should just say that this was everything going wrong was in extreme contrast to his father.
For whom
Henry
things,
V.
Indeed, who'd arguably created an unsustainable, rather like William the Conqueror conquering England, he created an unsustainable kingdom in which England and Normandy are divided by the sea and have their own interests and yet are linked. And in just the same way, Henry V, the Treaty of Troyes in whatever it is, 1420, he becomes the heir to the French throne, but then inconveniently dies before the French king dies. So it's sort of ambiguous. And we then have the rise of the Maid of Orleans, Joan of Arc.
Yes.
And the reversals of the English face in France. And I think it's also important to acknowledge, that the English nobility, they're obviously very engaged in French culture, but they know where their bread is buttered, which is in England. It's not really in France.
Yes.
And so they retreat. William is, in fact, captured at an engagement called Jargeau and is ransomed for a huge sum of money. But in England, meanwhile, the pressure is building. And in 1450, the Bishop of Salisbury is lynched by unpaid soldiers, Adam Malines, and he's a close associate of William. And William is basically then indicted in Parliament, and he's forced into exile by his political enemies. But
is there some suggestion that he was actually conspiring with the person who kidnapped him? Not kidnapped her, who took him, the person and that he never paid the ransom, and he, as a result, was sort of in hock to this Frenchman.
Well, the ransom creates all kinds of subsequent legal and political difficulties for the La Poles. I think whatever, it's very difficult to reconstruct exactly what happened. All these people,
but they were actually traitorous doings afoot.
Well, it's possible, but I don't know. I feel that you can overthink these things. What we do know is that his enemies are not content to see him being forced into exile. He writes, I think you dug up this rather wonderful letter. He writes to his son on his way to exile, which is quite funny. Not funny, but you're going to go on.
Yes, I thought, having found this important document, I would share it with listeners. It's one of those documents which is written by a father in dramatic circumstances because he's just going into exile and he doesn't know what the future will be. And of course, the future doesn't hold very much at all because he's dead within a couple of weeks. But he writes to his son with all sorts of bits of advice. I think we can say that all of which he has ignored.
In his own lifetime. Like every father's advice to his son. Of course,
he does make an interesting point that he must be very respectful and obedient to his mother, who is looking after this little boy. But the bit I particularly like is where he says towards the end, furthermore, as far as father may and can, I charge you in any wise to flee the company and counsel of proud men, of covetous men, and of flattering men.
His father.
He's more or less a self-portrait.
No, well, as they say, the best thing to do with good advice is pass it on.
Yes, quite.
No, well, I mean, he writes this letter and then he sets sail, and the ship, the ship is intercepted on its way to France by his enemies. He's dragged off it, and his head is hacked from his shoulders with what we're told, half a dozen strokes of a rusty sword.
Oh, I see. It's a long and painful business.
And his head is then thrust on a spear in Dover Sands. But it's really significant, the manner of his death, because a nobleman, of course, would be executed with a sword, a relatively painless, and you would have a skilled executioner. And so it's a quick way of dying. But by executing someone with a rusty sword and hacking their head off, you're demonstrating that you don't think that you're parodying in the most unpleasant way possible a nobleman's execution. And
but these were like a mob of sailors, weren't they? I mean, they weren't other noblemen like.
They could. I think.
We don't know.
I'm sure they were acting with protection of other people and the incitement.
I see.
Do you know what I mean?
I see. I thought it was like a popular. He was so unpopular.
And it's a ship. I think I seem to remember we're even told in the Paston letters, these 15th century letters from the Paston family, that the ship is called the St. Nicholas of the Tower, and that he's dragged off. He's hailed by the captain of the ship as hail traitor, and dragged off, and then he's basically decapitated on the side of the deck.
It's this sort of mock trial.
And
anyway.
and the violence, the response in England, this explosion of violence that there's
on his side,
against him.
Yes.
Jack Cade is rebellion in Kent, and the rebels enter London. They demand the execution or the removal of all kinds of favourites from William de Pole's circle from power. And fascinatingly, in this list, two people. One is Sir John Norreys, who builds a house called Occles in Berkshire, which still survives, which is a really important architectural parallel for Ewelme, in fact, but we don't really have time to talk about that. And the other person who's on this list, one of the other people, is Alice de la Pole. And in the aftermath of her husband's death,
yes,
she suddenly emerges as a really efficient political mover.
Is she one of these very rich medieval women, several marriages, who doesn't marry again and therefore becomes a force in her own right?
Well, indeed, she doesn't marry again. And I mean, she must have been concerned. I mean, she's born in 1404, so 1405. So she's 45. It's not at all impossible in the Middle Ages that someone with all this property, she might be compelled to marry again. But she doesn't. I mean, she basically navigates this political catastrophe with extraordinary skill.
There were other examples of extremely rich women who had become rich through marriage, who then could operate independently.
There certainly are, and Lady Margaret Beaufort would be one. As in the mother of Henry VII, would be a really good case in point. But within these circumstances, she is sort of struggling to survive, and she actually proves herself extraordinarily adept at this. There are a few battles she loses. She and her husband had managed to secure the marriage for their son, John de la Pole, of this great Beaufort heiress, in fact, Lady Margaret Beaufort. And that marriage, which was such a catch, is suppressed. She goes elsewhere, famously. But in many other respects, she does incredibly well, and she secures lots of her property. And, again, through the Paston letters that I referred to already, the Pastons can't stand her because she's always screwing them over. And she, like all these people, like all figures of this period, they're highly litigious. There's a lot of bullying going on, lots of assertion of control of things. But there's this wonderful letter written by Margaret Paston in the 1460s, I seem to remember, giving advice to her son who's trying to fight a legal case with Alice. And she says, don't have anything to do with her, because she is subtle and hath subtle counsel with her, and therefore it were well that there was someone with you of your mind. Because clearly, if you go into her presence,
he's a top lawyer.
She'll screw you through and through and through for anything she can get out of you.
How did she survive the Civil War? 1461. When is the king?
Well, indeed, this is all during during the slide into the Wars of the Roses, and she basically navigates her way with extraordinary skill, and she.
Because you would have thought her party would have lost everything.
Well, the point is that she then marries her son to the daughter, the sister of Edward IV, Elizabeth
I see.
Plantagenet.
So highly subtle
she
behaviour.
in fact entirely switches sides. And one of the really weird things that towards the end of her life is that Margaret of Anjou, who quite clearly she was a very great intimate with,
Yes. Another very strong lady.
Another very powerful and determined woman, she is put in her custody. Now, in the 19th century, people had thought this was rather sweet that, these two old friends were reunited in old age. But in fact, I think it's probably Edward IV almost as his cruelest, because he's putting Margaret of Anjou, who'd been the queen, in the pocket of the woman who she had made.
Oh, yes, I see.
Do you see what I mean? I think, in fact, it's an extremely...
Shakespeare should have done that one.
Yeah, kind of Goneril and Reagan.
He could have made something of it.
But, I mean, it's also worth saying that one of the really fascinating snapshots we have in the series of inventories I mentioned in Ewelme Palace, we know that Alice is also a patron of literature, she's a patron of John Lydgate, the poets, the monk of Bury St Edmunds. We know that she owned copies of various different books, including be familiar to a modern audience, Christian de Pisan's Les Cités des Dames, The City of Women, which is this proto-feminist text about how women, women in history, and in the inventories of the palace and the description of all the iconographies, the tapestries in the rooms, there seems to be an event, possibly a christening of one of her grandchildren, which the palace is decked up in all its finery. And we know that in her great chamber there was a tapestry of a scene of Achilles being vanquished by Amazonian warrioresses. And this is a scene from Les Cités. This is a chapter described in Les Cités des Dames. And, it's absolutely unquestionably, there is this sort of edge to her. There are lots of other rather amazing...
Standing up for herself.
Standing up for herself. Exactly. And
Amazonian.
And she, we do have 3 letters in the muniments, the paper, the documentary collection from Ewelme, 3 letters which are signed by her to obviously one of her servants called, I think, Robert Bilton, whom she refers to affectionately as my cock of Bilton. But I mean, she's also travelling around. Yeah, it could be misinterpreted. And we know that she's also patronising all kinds of architecture. She rebuilt Wingfield College, which is one of her husband's buildings. She commissions a massively expensive brass for William de la Pole after his murder, which is going to go in the Charter House at Hull, which was founded by the de la Pole family in Hull. And she also, creates her own tomb at Ewelme, which we sort of began with. But I mean, so she is effectively, she's running this whole estate. And
yes,
it's curious, you don't get a sense of great warmth or. Her son, John de la Pole, just comes across as slightly useless after her. She's clearly very driven. And I think you need to remember that, as we said at the very beginning, she goes from being, basically a commoner to being this, with her son married to the king's sister. I mean, this is an extraordinary trajectory by having been Countess of Salisbury, then Earl, Countess, and then Duchess of Suffolk. So this is it's a meteoric social career. And one thing I didn't know about at all, which was mentioned in this conference, is that there is this, while William de la Pole is still alive, she goes to Norwich with her friends and dresses up as a farm woman, and they obviously have some riotous party outside the walls of Norwich, and she's arrested by the city authorities in Norwich.
So is that a sort of Marie Antoinette-ish thing, or something?
It must have something. I mean, it's sort of the rich, wealthy people enjoying themselves, and then the city of Norwich has all, in punishment of having arrested her, they have all their privileges removed and things.
Oh, I see.
So it's a complete disaster for the for them. But I mean, how would they know that she's just dressed up for fun, clearly, as an ordinary woman, and they then pay the price.
Behaving righteous. Good grief. What an extraordinary image that is. I mean, that is so much evokes a personality.
Yes,
but what to make of it is just one little flash of insight.
Well, I think her personality is also reflected in the tomb, which we'll come to at the very end. I mean, I think, but It is also worth saying something about the school and the almshouse.
Well, I think totally, because these, I remember you saying, John, once, that these are the sort of, I mean, on a very grand scale, these are the parts that you would expect to find in a medieval manor. And it's unusual to have them surviving, such splendour, but also the fact that they do all survive together and continuing in use in terms of the church and the school.
And the continuance in use...
And the almshouse, I think.
Indeed. I mean, the continuance in use must reflect, royal ownership by Henry VIII. I mean, that must be the reason that they escaped the Reformation. Because these are things that they survive in other places, but very often these kinds of institutions are shut down.
Ensemble, they're very unusual, aren't they?
They are. And I suppose, that as with Eton and Windsor, this almshouse and the school are part of the landscape of a palace. That it's evidence of Christian charity that you're teaching people and you're looking after the poor within that area, and linking them to the church. I mean, it's an obvious thing for the Middle Ages to do, and you're through this endowment, you're basically creating a community that can pray for your soul and for the souls of the living and the needs of the living and the dead. So you're creating,
as we would understand, they weren't entirely charitable because there had to be a lot of praying. It was a lot, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean you're not getting your bed and breakfast for nothing, and so there are these statutes which are drawn up probably between 1448 and 1450. I don't know, they're probably about 12,000 words long, written in English, that describe the management of the almshouse. And I think you need to read them a little bit like the script of a play, in the sense that just because the statutes say this is what's going to happen, it doesn't mean that's how you actually live your life. But I would draw an analogy with a play, in the sense that at Ewelme you have the physical environment of the almshouse survives, like the set of a theatre, and you do have the statutes, which are the script. And so you can, and then we do also have accounts and various other things, very fragmentary, which allow you to put personalities into this thing in the 15th century. So, we know a little bit about the almsmen. We know something about, there's a very high turnover of almsmen, in fact, in this place. But I mean, we also,
keep on dying.
they're generally older.
Oh, I see. This is true.
They're, fascinatingly also, although they're meant to be, old, Ewelme is funded by the endowment of 3 estates, Marsh, Connaught and Ramridge, and the furthest afield are in Somerset. Well, we know that, in fact, some of the almsmen are being sent on a regular basis to go and collect rents from these far-flung places and sort of bring it back to the almshouse. And the almshouse is constituted with 13 almsmen. They're all to be men. That's the number of Christ and his apostles. Or maybe it's 12. Maybe it's 12. Sorry, it's 12 almsmen and 2 priests.
Yes.
So you've got the number of the apostles, and then the priests, sort of notionally, the master of the almshouse is the 13th, if you see what I mean. And then what the other priest runs the school. We know from the physical survival of the almshouse itself that most of those almsmen are living in small one-up, one-down rooms, connected probably by a wooden ladder, the upstairs. Both the top and the bottom room seem probably to have had fireplaces, slightly ambiguous, certainly a downstairs fireplace. And some of them are modest landholders. We know that...
The accommodation would not have been Spartan by the standards of the time, would it? I mean, to have had a room to yourself and a bedroom and a fireplace would have been, pretty 5-star.
Well, it would. Though I think. Well, I mean, it's certainly comfortable, and I mean, in an odd way, I think that the living domestic arrangements of sort of, as it were, secular and ecclesiastical figures really run in medieval society are more or less level with one another. I mean, if you're a monk and you're educated, for example, you're living, I think, you have very similar domestic education expectations to your peers in secular society. They're not sort of worlds apart from one another. And some of the almsmen are small landholders, and we know that because when they join the almshouse, they're obliged to give their property to the almshouse. So we actually know that there are some of these people who own small blocks of land. Well, they probably lived in houses that were, sort of.
And so for them, it was preferable to live and be looked after in this almshouse.
Yes, I mean, how far they were looked after is actually quite an interesting question because, there don't seem to be in any arrangements in the statutes for common eating, which is what you would expect. Oh. There is a common hall, but it's not clear whether this was used for meals collectively or whether people actually ate individually in their houses. What the statutes do reflect is that the almsmen are keeping all the canonical hours, so matins, vespers, lauds, sext, nones, compline, all these liturgical hours where you recite the psalms, they do all this, and they have to go to mass every day. And they also have to wear, as a sort of mark of their membership of the Suffolk's household, they have to wear a livery. So livery is the clothing you give out, and it's meant to be a black gown with a red cross sewn to it. And so they're identified
quite chic.
rather gothic. They are clearly identified as members of the almshouse, and that they're therefore objects of the charity of the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk. And it should be said that the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk are also running another almshouse in Hull, and we do have in the Ewelme Muniments again this really fascinating document which lists a whole group of people, all men again, who have clearly applied to be members of the almshouse in Hull. Yes. And you imagine, Alice as a duchess, busy about her work, and her chaplain coming to her and saying, there are spaces in the almshouse in Hull. We have this man who was a ferryman for 25 years and honest and things. And is he any good? And she, yes, let him in. Yes, and yes, that's fine. Yeah, no, not him. Again, the sense of a really busy person having things reported to them.
Yes.
So it's
spending 2 seconds on
each one.
You can imagine. Actually, I have to say that I have a friend who is resident in a very grand almshouse which survives from the Middle Ages. I cannot name him, or I think he is probably. But anyway, he's discovered that he's allergic to perfume, and so he can't go to the masses with all their incense.
Oh my goodness! Well,
he has to stay in bed, probably.
What an ingenious excuse!
I'm not saying it's an excuse, John. I'm just saying that this late in life, this allergy is
desperately trying to construct a reason why he could lie in bed.
So I wonder how much of that went on, but probably not in the Middle Ages.
But I mean, and we do also know that the money for the almsmen, which is distributed each week, is paid on the tomb of Thomas and Maud Chaucer, Alice's parents. And this is a very common arrangement, in fact, in the Middle Ages, that you distribute charitable giving from the dead from their tombs. And it's a way of personifying the gift.
Yes.
And indeed, in Hull, again, we know that in the Charterhouse at Hull, that Alice commissions, she draws up a legal document which survives in draft, and she commissions 2 statues, one of herself and one of her husband, and they're both holding a loaf of bread and a jug of oil in their hands. And from these statues, there are to be distributed gifts of bread and oil to the poor of Hull. So again, that's really a rather weird thing that you have, more than one image of yourself and it's distributing.
How interesting. So the statue stood.
Well, we don't know. I think they're in the refectory of the Charterhouse at Hull,
and representing
these people, and then you have this idea of a perpetual charity, and
of course. The idea of purgatory, and that purgatory was a doctrine which came in the late Middle Ages, wasn't it? And was very had a great influence on this sort of activity because, of course, the more people said masses for you, the less time you were going to spend
in purgatory.
In this terrible purgatory, which we didn't want to.
No, well, I mean, I think
might have lasted for eons. And of course, rich people had obviously done much worse things in their lives. But on the other hand, they were so rich they could they had this get out of jail card.
I mean, I think that
they could found these foundations.
It is. I mean, there are definitely 2 sides to this. That in the sense that purgatory and this fear of purgatory and the desire to.
Because I mean, isn't that all about also the cadaver?
Well, before we come, you're right, and we should, because we're nearly at the end, and we should come to that finally. But I suppose it's important to understand that in a world that recognises divine intervention in everything, places that are offering prayers are a kind of powerhouse that is engaging both with the needs of the living but also with the dead. And so purgatory is crucially important in that regard. People feel that they need to have their sins, that prayers will bring them out of purgatory and take them to heaven more quickly. And I think that is a very real concern. But there is also the sense, and these things are engaging the spiritual resources on your behalf in life. And then there is, of course, this, paradoxically, this very secular purpose to them.
Yes.
They're displays of power, they're displays of status and identity. And so all great palaces worth their salt, or great houses worth their salt, have a great religious foundation beside them. And that religious foundation performs prayers, and it can perform charitable things, typically looking after almsmen, and in the 15th century, educating people in schools. And it should be said that, the Ewelme School is a very substantial building, because often school arrangements are, in the Middle Ages, are relatively, informal, that they can take place in almost any
So
structure.
this was also a relatively new thing, and presumably education would have been monastic.
Indeed. I think, though there is, again, somebody else spoke about this, much more learned than I, saying that there is, in fact, a sort of tradition of professional teaching, not just within a monastic context, going back at least into the 11th century. But, of course, in monastic context, there's education going back, and absolutely to the year dot. And so, there is, really, with the encouragement of Henry VI, there is this big burst of interest in educational foundations.
Yes. Now, John, we must confront our end.
Indeed.
In the shape of the cadaver.
So the party piece of Ewelme, indeed, you go and you walk through past the school, up through the almshouse quadrangle, and up the stairs into the church. And the church is much reorganised by Alice de la Pole, and but her chapel is behind the rood screen that divides the interior, on the right hand side, and it's a chapel dedicated to John the Baptist, and it's covered. It's much restored in its detail, but it's an absolutely extraordinary collection of surviving medieval fittings. There's in this chapel, quite a low room, there's a splendid panelled angel roof that covers the whole interior. And then all walls are painted with the monogram of Jesus, IHS. So Jesus basically spelled J-E-H-U-S, but with the E and the U taken out, which was also thought in the Middle Ages of reflecting Jesus hominibus salvator, Jesus, the saviour of men. And around the upper part of the wall are inscriptions, all talking about the power of the name of Jesus. And this is all sort of theologically important, because the moment at which Christ is thought to have been conceived is the moment when the angel Gabriel at the Annunciation says to Mary, his name is Jesus. So this moment where Christ becomes human is connected with his name. John the Baptist's name is also very significant in the biblical account. You may remember that his father doesn't believe he's about to have a son, but when he writes his name is John, he can speak. He's struck dumb for not, not believing he's going to have a son. And when he writes his name is John, he can speak again. So John the Baptist is a precursor of Christ. His name is important, and Christ's name, Jesus' name, is very important, and it reflects this moment of his incarnation, which is, of course, also during the Mass, when the body and blood, the wine and bread become the body and blood of Christ. That is a moment of incarnation. So all these things are celebrating this idea of incarnation. And so when you turn then to the tomb monument, and you see as the pole above in her finery, and underneath as a cadaver, if you lie down on the floor and look up, and you'll see that she's actually looking at the Annunciation above her, which is, of course, the moment, the painting of the Annunciation, which is itself the moment of incarnation. So all these themes really sort of cleverly...
Was that a particularly feminine thing?
The fascinating thing is that the name of Jesus becomes a feast, but only after her death. This interior is being conceived in advance of the general reception of the cult of the name of Jesus as
I was thinking of the Annunciation, and in fact it was a pregnancy.
Yes.
Was that of particular meaning because she was a woman?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, I'd not really thought of that. I mean, it's possible. I suppose what I think about it is it shows that almost certainly, though we have no documentary proof, it's almost certainly the case that she must have designed that tomb and the chapel and its devotions. It's not it's not the kind of thing that it's not something that somebody else would do. Ah. And there's a final, amusing detail about the tomb is that it's vastly expensive. It's almost certainly made by London tomb makers. Jolly.
No, it is the most gruesome and grisly thing, isn't it?
It is, but almost certainly made by London tomb makers from the 1470s towards the end of her life. And it must have been erected, obviously, after she's buried. But what's really interesting is that when they did erect it, they'd made a terrible mistake. The canopy of the tomb is narrower than the tomb was. And so they had to chop a section of the tomb out to make it fit. So this enormously expensive thing, which is, unique in all sorts of ways. It's the only alabaster cadaver, it's the only surviving cadaver of a woman, that we know that others did exist. It's the only double-decker tomb of this kind where the cadaver is sort of concealed and all sorts of things about it. And also it's, of course, a tomb and a monument in its original context, which is so exciting and, interesting. But they just made a complete mess of it. And so it's crammed in, and you can see this because if you look at the sides of the tomb, there are angel panels, each panel divided by a single pinnacle. And there's a point where there's a double pinnacle because they just had to slice one angel out of the design. So maybe it's this tomb,
it's reassuringly human.
Exactly. Well, the monument, which is a monument in a way, paradoxically suggesting humility, her humility and how her humility is going to bring her to heaven, but humility paradoxically expressed in the grandest possible monument, is also the monument itself is rather flawed.
I think strangely it's something we can all relate to in building projects of a much humbler kind.
Of a much humbler kind, indeed.
John, I've got to say that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to Charlie Aslett, who has been editing this episode. If you enjoyed it, do please feel free to leave a review. A review on whatever platform you have listened to it on. 5 stars are very acceptable. And do go along and visit our website, which is www.ypompod.com, and there you can sign up for a newsletter which will tell you what's coming, what we've been doing, and you can also find an email if you want to tell us how you responded.
Indeed.
Goodbye until next time. And next time we're going to be talking, because this is the summer, about a seaside resort.
Called Ramsgate.
Ramsgate. As in Ramsgate Sands. Anyway, join us then, and we look forward to it very much.